Ukraine and Canada share a strategic relationship. It is bolstered by a large Ukrainian diaspora in Canada and an extensive legal framework that allows for easy cooperation. Yet we must ask, does the label strategic reflect the real nature of their bilateral ties? And in light of Russia's aggression, is Canada responding adequately to the Russian threat on a global scale? You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. This episode is part of a joint series Ukraine's global partnerships produced by UkraineWorld and the Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prism. In this episode, Deputy Chief Editor of UkraineWorld Anastasiia Hersymchuk spoke with Dr. Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald Laurier Institute in Canada, and Yevhen Hlibovytsky, Director of the Frontier Institute in Ukraine. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolko, I'm Chief Editor of UkraineWorld. You can support us at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our regular volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. You can find these links in the description of this episode. This episode is created with the support of the International Renaissance Foundation. So, let's start.
Balkan, Yevhen, welcome and thank you for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for inviting.
Ukraine and Canada are geographically distant states that are situated on different continents, but they are bound by strategic partnership that transcend mere formality. These relations are multifaceted and substantive. And in our exploration of these nations' bilateral relations, let's begin with their human dimension. And here I mean the Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. It is the second biggest diaspora of Ukrainians in the world. And there is this fact that first Ukrainians arrived in Canada in 1891. So, Yevhen, does the Ukrainian diaspora play any role in the development of relations between these states? And can we say that it contributes to the development of Canada, I mean the Ukrainian community?
Well, I think the Ukrainian presence in Canada has been substantial over the years, and it has actually given us an insight of where Ukraine could have been if it was not captured by the communists and if it was not retained as part of the Russian colonial sphere of influence. We see that Ukrainians in Canada have become a part of Canadian society, a contributing part of Canadian society. And we see that Ukrainians have managed to succeed in multiple areas of life, be that business, politics, social affairs, military, you name it. So basically what the Canadian experience tells us, it's telling us that Ukraine as a culture, Ukraine as a nation is completely capable. And if it was invisible because the world was seeing Ukraine through colonial perspective for a very long time, it was not because Ukrainians did something that would diminish their capacity, that would destroy their capability, but it was because the historical consequences were particularly harsh around the historical environment was particularly harsh for Ukraine, and it was quite difficult for Ukraine to succeed while having to deal with results of mass famine, Second World War, Soviet occupation, Chernobyl, and other catastrophes that Ukrainian nation had to go through. And now, of course, the war of Russia on Ukraine.
Well, with this important human dimension and of relations between two countries, and this familiarity of the nature of two nations since they have been living side by side for many years. Let's move to the political dimension of these relations. And mm, our countries often declare strategic partnerships through official agreements. And Ukraine and Canada have signed um, many such agreements. Like Ukraine and Canada have vast and developed legal framework of bilateral cooperation, including ones on free trade, and recently the security cooperation agreement was signed. But Balkan, the question is, do these formal agreements really lead to true partnership in practice? And Ukraine and Canada actually, are they actually working together as closely as these agreements suggest?
Thank you. Just let me add two things on the human dimension before getting into the details when it comes to whether the reality reflects what is on paper when it comes to closer cooperation. Number one, as you both pointed out, the significant number of Ukrainian diaspora, it's about 5%, close to 5% of Canadian population can trace their ancestry to Ukraine and Ukrainians. So it is a significant population, particularly in the prairies in the west of Canada, in places like Alberta and Saskatchewan and other places. So it is a very important one. And for the audience, it's also important to sort of highlight that the second most important politician in the country, Chrystia Freeland, the deputy prime minister and the finance minister, is of course of Ukrainian descent. She speaks fluent Ukrainian, etc. Diaspora politics is one, and the contribution of diaspora another. But it's also important to highlight the ease with which the new arrivals after the full-scale invasion in February 2022 from Ukraine. I think the numbers are around 250,000 or so that decided to stay in Canada. Don't quote me on that. I might be wrong about the exact number, but it is in the hundreds of thousands. Integrated very, very quickly. We do here in Ottawa and other places regularly came across newly immigrated Canadians, Ukrainians to Canada, and the speed with which they started contributing to Canada, to its political, economic, social, cultural life, is also a testament to, I would say, the resilience and the ingenuity and the innovativeness and hard work of Ukrainians that Canada actually observed across the last century and more. So it is the tradition of Ukrainians coming to Canada and contributing to Canada actually continues to increase. When it comes to the sort of what is on paper versus what is being done, I would like to highlight two things. One, as you pointed out, there's a number of agreements from free trade to security cooperation and partnership, so on and so forth, between Canada and Ukraine. And there is a very broad support within the Canadian public for those agreements and continuing support for Ukraine for its defense, its struggle against Russian imperialism and attempts for subjugating Ukraine and Ukrainian people. When it comes to delivering on those promises, I would say there are two limitations. Number one, especially on the military side, when it comes to providing military support, the Canadian armed forces gave a number of Leopard tanks, some anti-tank batteries, as well as long-range fires, but they are limited in terms of what is being provided, because there's not much that the Canadian Armed Forces actually has on its own arsenal. When you look at the Canadian National Defence and their announcements, the amounts of things that are being pledged versus what has been delivered is different. I don't know the exact recent numbers right now. I need to go back and look at the website. But just a few weeks ago, the assessment was about 44% of what is being promised has been delivered since the war. Now, some of it has to do with the Canadian bureaucracy, the slowness of the procurement process, getting things in order and sending them, etc., the lack of political will on the government to expedite these stuff. The others are to do with the existing capacity issues worldwide. The biggest example is, of course, air defense systems that Canada promised back in January 2023, but did not deliver yet. The reason: Americans are producing it. We're waiting for them to produce. And they said it's going to come. When it comes, it will be delivered. So there are issues in terms of what is being promised and laid down compared to what is actually being promised, what is being delivered on the one hand. And the last thing I would say here is that the way the overall numbers would depend on who are you asking and what are you including in terms of humanitarian aid support for this displaced people, as well as support for government. But about half of it is in material terms, in ammunition, in tanks, in drones and stuff like that. The other half are loans. It's important to also note that when we talk here in Canada, we try to highlight the notion that supporting Ukraine is not charity but self-interest, and we'll talk about that, I believe. But it is also important to note that the support given to Ukraine from Canada, most of it is not aid as in things that are not going to be paid back. So most of them are in loans, and there is much more Canada can do to actually fulfill the promises that are made in the security partnerships and others, given the fact that Canada has one of the largest public support in providing what Ukraine needs to defend itself, to defend its sovereignty, independence, and way of life. So yes, there is a discrepancy between what is being promised and what is being written, compared to what has been delivered so far.
Balkan, you've just mentioned the security dimension of bilateral relations, especially in face of current security challenges, and actually the biggest security challenge that can be faced by a state, the war of aggression. And here I would like to step back and look at the evolution of how Canada has been supporting Ukraine since the very beginning of the Russian aggression. And here I mean that Canada was one of the most vocal supporters of Ukraine, not just since the full scale invasion, but back from the 2014 when actually the Russian aggression started. So, can we say that the nature of this support has changed? Has it evolved? Or actually, what has changed over these years? And how the full scale invasion influenced this way of supporting? Maybe it also changed the ways how Canada perceives the global threats, regional threats.
I think that's a very good question, and I would say that I would try to answer it in two parts. One, how Canadian perceptions of Russian aggression and bellicosity changed across since 2014 and the initial invasion in Donbass and the illegal annexation of Crimea, to the full scale invasion in 2022. It is also important to remember that, going back to the broad-based support in the public, it was under a conservative government, under Stephen Harper's government in 2014, that Canada was one of the first that strongly condemned and opposed the illegal annexation of Crimea. Harper looked at Putin and told him to get out of Crimea. Canada did push quite actively to kick Russia out of G8, turning it to G7, etc. So there was a strong broad-based support going back at least a decade across the political spectrum, be it the conservatives back in 2014 or the liberals in 2022. Now, what really changed over time is an increasing recognition within both the policymakers in the bureaucracy in global affairs and in national defense, as well as in the political class, that what happened in 2014 is not just one of a blip in the historical trajectory of the Russian state, but a continuation of the attempts to impose Kremlin's will on its neighbors. And what you do see across since 2014 and coming up to 2022, especially after the full-scale invasion, is that the Canadian policymakers started to recognize that if we do not push back against Russian revanchism in Ukraine, we will continue to suffer the consequences here as well. What is now you keep hearing in the media and the policymakers, which you did not hear 5 years ago, was that Russia is not to the far east of us. Russia is our neighbor to the north, and this Arctic dimension, and recognizing that uh, what Russians are doing in Ukraine will have repercussions on what Russians are going to do and doing in the Arctic. It's the same mindset, it's the same mentality, that it has significant consequences for Canadian sovereignty and security and prosperity. That became, I think, very clear since 2022, but you do see a gradual increase of that recognition. And of course, after 2022, you have a number of sanctions imposed on Russian individuals and banks and entities. But whether they are being enforced properly or not is a different story. There are still big loopholes, particularly, unfortunately, in the global affairs, which I would highlight one thing that keeps bugging me since 2022 February is the fact that Canada still did not expel a single Russian quote unquote diplomat from Canada. Dozens of our allies in Europe and elsewhere kicked out those intelligence officers and agents masquerading as diplomats. Overall, over 600 of them were kicked out by dozens of our allies. Canada yet to expel one Russian intelligence operator or officer here in Canada. So there is still things that needs to be done, and there are still pockets within the government bureaucracy that are not aware of the consequences of Russia's behavior and the true nature of the Kremlin regime. So yes, there is increasing recognition within the broader public, as well as the policymaker, about the threat that Russia poses to our friends and allies, but not only in Europe, also to us, to Canadian sovereignty and security in the Arctic. But you you still have people that are unwilling to take action and still go back to the old adages about reciprocity and we need to keep the communication channels open and all that kind of old talk. So it's a mixed bag of development. But going back and just gonna wrap up here. Important to remember that again, it was under the Conservative government in 2014. It was Stephen Harper that looked at Putin and told him to get out of Crimea. It is under the Trudeau Liberals that Canada opened up its doors for those who are affected from Russian invasion and welcome Ukrainians to Canada and promised loans and military support to Ukraine. So it is a broad-based cross partisan support that did not diminish, if anything, increase. Can we do more? Yes. Are there loopholes and the things that we should have done much better? Absolutely.
Let me jump in here because I would like to say that from the Ukrainian perspective, it sounds really important that Canada is devoting so much attention to Ukraine. It's really important that Ukraine has a friend in the G7, that Ukraine has a friend in the West that can understand not only through political lens, but also through the human dimension where Ukraine is. But I would generally say that from the Ukrainian perspective, the Canadian involvement generally falls in the too little, too late kind of approach that is inherent for the West in the Russian-Ukrainian war. Um, uh, we could have had a greater support, more meaningful support, if there was greater appreciation of the security threat. My impression from my discussions in Canada, from my talks with different people and experts and politicians, is that Canada, like many countries in Europe, and maybe in a different way than the United States, but very much like the Western mainstream, is rather asleep than awakened by the Russian aggression. And there's a sensitive there's not enough sensitivity that would suggest the acuteness of threat. Canada is quite exposed. It's exposed from the Arctic, it's exposed from the Atlantic, it's exposed from the Pacific Ocean. Canada has a huge territory. Canada has Arctic border with Russia. But still, this does not ring a bell. And security is not high on the agenda of society, and security is not high on the political agenda, comparing to the threats that we experience.
If I may just jump here and at one thing, and I completely agree with Yevhen on his assessment, and would like to also highlight that there is a complete lack of sense of urgency here in Canada when it comes to defense and security issues. It is changing slowly, and everyone is sort of ringing the alarm bells. But he's perfectly right and accurate when he points out that too little, too late, unfortunately, has been the motto and the operating principle here in Canada, as it was on some of the other Western allies as well. There is a lack of understanding of why this has to be urgent. That there is no neither Ukraine nor the West has several years ahead to wait to solve things and do it as if we are doing it in peacetime. That is the mentality here. And I'll give you one example, which I think reflects this lack of urgency in terms of taking action. There is an amendment to a bill in Canadian Parliament that has been waiting since October that would allow Canada, not only there's already frozen assets, Russian assets held in Canadian dollars, but seize those assets to help and provide to Ukraine for its defense and support. And this has been waiting. And when you talk to people, they cite a bunch of very safety-oriented legalese about should we do it? Are we going to do it? We don't want to be the first one. I mean, when you look at it, the underlying logic is we don't want to be the first one to seize the Russian assets. If our allies in G7 do it, we'll jump onto it. But if we don't want to be the one who do it first. So that sense of lack of urgency is a problem. And there is a significant amount, as my friends and colleagues, Aaron Burnett and Benjamin Tallis, have been drumming this particular, beating this particular drum. There is about $19 billion worth of Canadian dollars worth of Russian assets that are held in Euroclear in Canadian dollars, in which the Canadian central bank can actually seize them. And unfortunately, there is still about should we use the interests? How are we going to proceed? Can we provide loans based on it? There's still a lot of technical talk and a lack of urgency. Again, this is we still need to switch our understanding in the West, and particularly in Canada, that we are, as the outgoing Chief of Defense Staff, General Ayer here in Canada, said, we are in a pre-war environment for Canada. Of course, Ukraine is already at war right now. We cannot operate with peacetime mentality. We cannot allow things to go through the course for 10 years. Ukraine doesn't have 10 years. We don't have 10 years. We need to be able to face the Russian aggression and potential Russian aggression beyond Ukraine today. And the Canadians are slow, unfortunately, to wake that up.
The phenomenon that we are seeing is something that can be described as security intoxication. This we've seen in the continental Europe, where the United States and some other countries were picking up most of the financial bill for security. And the society has learned to enjoy security without having to pay for it the full cost. And later, when there was already second and third generation living in these conditions, the society started taking security for granted. So this security intoxication is really harmful now for building up the priorities. For instance, when the public health expenditures overburden the state budget, it's difficult to talk about increase in military defense spendings because they basically come at the cost of social and healthcare and infrastructure spendings, and the society feels it. But the society at the same time cannot understand the full set of consequences that would come should, for instance, the security umbrella collapse. It looks very unlikely from the Canadian perspective that the security umbrella would collapse. Therefore, instead of actually making sure that it doesn't collapse where it's most vulnerable, Canadians generally turn a blind eye at the changes in the global security environment. And these changes will come back and bite the Canadian consumer as well through change in international trade, through general change in international agenda. And we see already in, for instance, Canadian-Chinese relations that the situation is not optimistic at all. And Ukraine is a litmus test whether the society is actually awakened or the society is seeing itself as insured against any future vulnerabilities.
Indeed, these are very important and very interesting insights. And I'd say that it is very important to realize the imminent threats on time. And Ukrainian experience actually tell that when it is seen that there are security threats, even if they are not that evident from the first glance, it may take just a short while to turn everything in a hot phase of the conflict and get the situation into disaster. So if a threat seems very distant, it doesn't mean that it will not turn into something very close and real in the near future. And another issue is that even if the threat doesn't have this war phase, it doesn't mean that it will not affect a certain society distantly in economic terms or in the terms of social welfare, etc. So current history and the painful experience of Ukraine actually shows the world that it is important to be determined in terms of defending liberal world values and actually to fight for justice and peace. And here, like thinking about what we've just discussed, I would like to rope it up into a prospective vision. Like these painful experiences of Ukraine, the current security state, all these processes, um, and the lessons that are being taught to the world, can they lead Ukraine and Canada to a new type of cooperation? What prospects of cooperation we can find here? Maybe we can develop something that has already existed and intensify these kinds of cooperation. Or maybe current security challenges may help us to find new areas for fruitful cooperation.
Um, let me highlight two things on this going forward. I will be a little pessimistic in terms of the way in which our societies, particularly in the West, in Canada, coming to grasps with the severity of the situation. We don't want to pay pennies today. We will pay hundreds of dollars in the future. As a result, we're not, as Yevhen very rightly pointed out, we the comfort and thinking that the threat is far away and it's not going to come here and we should be fine, will cost us dearly. Historically, that unfortunately has been the case. And again, just to quote the outgoing, recently retired chief of defense staff here in Canada, General Eyre, both in both First World War and the Second World War, Canada caught unprepared, and we paid the price both economically and in blood. So it's not only treasure but blood, and of course Ukraine is paying the ultimate price today. In defending their home and hearth. I am unfortunately pessimistic about the recognition of the threat and what needs to be done, what we call here the national security premium. The thing that we need to pay, and it is again pennies on the dollar today, and it's a very small price to pay for our defense and security and prosperity, and we're unwilling to do that, including, it's very obvious with the Canadian defense spending, with unwillingness to really take very minimum risks when it comes to imposing harsher sanctions on Russia, seizing Russian assets. Canada has very little exposure to Russia in terms of economic ties. There is basically almost no downside for Canada to seize those assets, etc. And we're unwilling to do that. And this the argument, this supposed trade-off between guns versus butter, do you spend money on health and education and whatnot versus military spending and defense, is of course is a false one, is a false dichotomy. Under the current circumstances, if you don't have the guns, soon you will not have the butter, and I think that is increasingly clear to our friends and allies in the eastern flank of NATO, from Baltics to Poland and to others, as they experience the Ukrainian fight for their sovereignty, for their identity, for their right to exist as a people. But we are not there yet. Now, going forward, I would highlight, despite being this pessimistic, and I think it will take a direct threat and paying a big cost for Canada, both in terms of blood and treasure, that would only wake people up. Despite being that pessimistic, I would like to highlight maybe two areas in which Canada can actually make a meaningful contribution to the defense of Ukraine, which is fundamentally also the defense of the West. One is definitely the seizing of the Russian assets. Again, I keep getting back to that, but it is a very important one. It will cost nothing to the Canadian people. It will provide close to 20 billion Canadian dollars for Ukraine, that can be used for weapon purchases, ammunition, different systems, and support for social services, and pretty much anything and everything, including the reconstruction of the country. So that's number one. So we could do that almost immediately, and I think that would actually make a meaningful difference. The other one is, of course, cooperation when it comes to defense innovation. Now, it sounds interesting and kind of out of place to talk about defense innovation, but of course, Ukraine and Ukrainians are at the edge of how to fight a major war against a great power. It is that experience is invaluable, be it drone technology, electronic warfare, tactics based on the ground, combining typical old school artillery with new tech, including surveillance drones and first person drones and others, and so on and so forth. It is a field in which Ukraine right now is leading the world, and Canada and Canadian defense can actually learn a lot on this. Be it through joint production, development of weapon systems, be it drones, be it electronic warfare, be it artillery systems, be it armored personnel carriers. When you send them, what happens? How do they function? What needs to be done to make them work in a real life environment compared to your labs here in in the prairies? Things might work perfectly, but they don't necessarily work on the battlefield. That is an area in which Canada and Ukraine can actually work strongly together, and producing things in Ukraine jointly with Canadian defense companies, supported by the Canadian government, underwritten those investment guarantees, and providing opportunities for the Canadian companies to go to help and to invest in Ukrainian defense over there. Those are, I would say, two areas in which we could make a meaningful contribution today.
Yes, Yevhen, do we have a Ukrainian perspective on the future potential spheres of cooperation?
Well, I think Canada is extremely well positioned to become a crucial partner for Ukraine, because Canada is one of those countries that actually can have sensible input into relations on multiple levels. We are talking about human dimension, business, trade, technologies, education, military cooperation, political cooperation. Ukraine and Canada share a lot of common values, and Ukraine and Canada, I think, are destined to belong to the same international clubs. Now, the question is whether the political groups that are making decisions see the picture holistically. And the honest answer at this point is probably that they prefer to use very localized optics. And through that localized optics, there are many things that we don't see. I've mentioned before that Canada is exposed through the oceans that surround Canada, and the issues with freedom of navigation that Russia is causing, with spoofing, with multiple other ways how Russia is acting as a spoiler. These are all wake-up calls for Canada. Also, the other issue is that some of the threats are not coming they're not dependent on the distance. For instance, disinformation attacks or cyber attacks. It doesn't really matter where the attacks are coming from. They are felt instantly and very locally. And in that sense, Ukraine is actually right now on the frontier, fighting the very source of multiple attacks that are actually aimed at Canada, while Canada doesn't really is not really fully aware of this. It's time to remilitarize. It's time to learn from Ukraine what kind of warfare is actually practiced right now. It's time to update the perception of modern warfare. Unfortunately, Ukraine has a lot of experience that it gained through the last 3 years of war, almost 3 years of war. But at the same time, I think there are many other fields of cooperation that are possible. Canada and Ukraine are the stakeholders of international order as countries that don't belong to the club of the great powers. And Canada, like Ukraine, is not a permanent member of the Security Council. Canada, like Ukraine, is similar in population, and Canada, like Ukraine, is also the country that relies very much on immigration in its future demographic policy. So Canada and Ukraine have a lot of things that they could talk about and that they could share. I think it's important that we start on the same page. And it hurts me to say that we're not there yet, even though we should have been there.
Yeah, and let's finish our insightful conversation here with these deep and insightful thoughts about the future and the essence and of our bilateral relations and what we actually want and need to be done and to be understood. Yevhen, Balkan, thank you for joining this episode and thank you for this interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a multilingual website about Ukraine. In this episode, UkraineWorld's Deputy Chief Editor Anastasiia Hersymchuk spoke with Dr. Balkan Devlen, Director of the Transatlantic Program at the Macdonald Laurier Institute in Canada, and Yevhen Hlibovytsky, Director of the Frontier Institute in Ukraine. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the largest Ukrainian media NGOs. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko, I'm Chief Editor of UkraineWorld. You can support our work at patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We provide exclusive content for our patrons. You can also support our volunteer trips to the frontline areas at PayPal, Ukraine.resisting@gmail.com. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.